So we have a lab session today. Oh boy, we're gonna actually do things with our hands. Incredible. However, we have a lab session that is necessarily remote, and therefore we're gonna do stuff with our hands in our own houses. Um, so when I was talking to Linning about like, oh gosh, what are we gonna do for this lab session? Because we don't really have time to get anybody materials. Particularly, I was talking to you about like soft goods, e-textiles. Some of those materials are kind of specific, right? Like probably not very many of you have conductive thread in your house, for example. Some of you might. Also though, Linning knows this, other people may know this as well. I'm like constantly obsessed with animation. So I'm like, let's just do an animation lab. That could be really fun. So here's how it's gonna go. I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about like how is animation, like how's this real? It's sort of real. I'm gonna talk to you how stop motion works, just super quickly. It's all gonna be super high level. And I'm gonna give you some instructions, and then we're gonna do it for real. Okay. So as a quick amount of overview here, animation as a research method, specifically kind of a research through design method. Research through design is its whole own little subfield of HCI research. The idea that you're doing design methods towards creating a research project. This is a work of mine that I believe I showed the other day, but I'm just gonna like show it again super quickly. It's an actual piece of actuated clothing. I made this thing, I sewed it, there's actual motors involved. It really genuinely works. If you saw this in person, it would actually still do the same thing. It took me like a year to build this. I mean, not like all full-time or anything, but it took me a pretty long time to make this, which is fine because I did a bunch of sketches and stuff first. But the point is, these fully worked through systems can be quite a bit of investment in terms of time and energy and materials and stuff. So I also want to show you a project I did earlier with no budget. This is what I would think of as like my first actuated clothing piece. And it looks like this. We've got these cool like morphing sleeves and morphing pants, and this part's a little hard to understand out of context actually, but these sort of unfolding ruffles. And how did you make these, Leia? I didn't, I cheated. This is movie magic. These things don't actually do this in reality, right? This is an animation. So I just took a bunch of pictures of this thing unzipping and crumpling and folding up, and I stitched them together, and it kind of looks real. I mean, it's not like convincing, but it gives you the idea. And so that's what I'm saying when I'm talking about like a sketch. It's something that's not necessarily trying to convince you that it is genuine reality, but it's a way to start thinking about what that motion even is before you invest a bunch of engineering effort in actually making it real. Okay, this isn't just me. This is a legitimate research through design method. Come on. This is a video out of Hiroshi Ishii's lab at MIT that is itself, I would argue, a research product. It is a vision for how a potential tangible radical bits and atoms future could be. We could have this kind of magical material that you just gesture at with tools, and then the shapes sort of come perfectly out because they're computer mediated in some way. So this is like a hypothesis, like a research hypothesis and a vision that is realized here through kind of janky actually, but very convincing stop motion animation. All right, so he's just doing quick cuts between how each of these things are used in the video. And I find this a really compelling video, and I actually think in many ways it's more compelling than like a computer rendering of the same thing, because the whole point of this is that it is going to be a tangible thing in the real world. So even if it's like, oh, it's not super high frame rate, you still feel it as like a real thing. So that's the kind of like, why are we doing this? And is this even legit? Yes, it is. And I think the other thing is I'm kind of trying to ground you here that it doesn't have to be super, super, super polished to still convey an idea. And actually, I find that animation in some ways can be less polished than like a drawn sketch, because the way that you're moving through the images very quickly, it still can tell a story. Humans love motion. Like motion is very compelling to us, even if it's not perfectly realistic. So I also want to be clear, like actual stop motion animation, like real genuine movie quality stop motion animation is an incredibly interesting field. Super highly talented expertise is involved in making those, but the easy stop motions are really easy. So how are we going to do this? Your goal is to capture a sequence of images. You probably know this, but I'm just going to say it again, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. The way these animations work is you take a bunch of still images where something has changed just a little bit between the images. Actual animation in real life is in the past 18 frames a second. These days, high-res movies, video games, 60 frames a second, you know, fairly large number of frames per second. But in this kind of sketching context, I actually find it's totally fine to have 3 to 5. That is actually still enough to kind of sell emotion. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but you can get your images first and then kind of scale how many frames a second there are later to kind of tune in, like, should this be a really fast motion? Should this be a slow motion? You can kind of do that part in software. And again, each picture is just a little bit different from the previous one. If all the frames are being played at the same rate, of course, that means that if you make a bigger difference between the two frames, it will feel like a faster motion. That's a very foundational concept in animation. It can be actually surprisingly easy to lose track of that fact, but taking a bunch of pictures, changing things a little bit between each frame, how much a little bit is kind of up to you, but bigger motions, faster motions. Okay. Again, distilled down to the super basic steps, what you're going to need to make the actual animation is you're going to need to set up a camera, you're going to need to take a bunch of pictures, and you're going to need to stitch them together. Setting up the camera is itself some work, so I've allocated a fair amount of workshop time just to that. The biggest things that are important, the camera itself needs to stay still, right? If you're changing things a little bit between each frame, the camera needs to stay in one position so it doesn't look like the whole movie's just like shaking. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. And then ideally, you do want good lighting, where good means strong and consistent. In this context, because we're sketching, you know, it's okay for things to be a little bit flickery. If you do go down this road, if you're interested in this method, I would really recommend artificial light. The challenge with shooting with daylight is that if it's cloudy, like your images could be wildly differently lit, like from frame to frame, which is something you don't really notice if you're taking a constant video, but if you're taking a bunch of frames over time, it comes out. You can actually fix that in Premiere though, so it's all possible. So setting up your camera, I have 2 basic tips for you today. And the first one is going to show you a concrete way of actually doing this. I made this video last night. You can see I'm already in my pajamas. I made my partner help me make this video. And this whole video, this whole process took 1.5 minutes. Like you can see this screen recording on the left is 1.5 minutes. Oh, there we go again. Wonderful. Another suggestion, generally, maybe not today's class, but generally you can set your camera up so that you're shooting downward. This is really easy. This video here shows how this person just sets her camera up like on a book overhanging the edge of a table or a chair or something. Very easy to do with a phone. You won't bump it very much. And this style of stop motion animation can be really compelling because you kind of don't have to worry about gravity, right? You're just sort of animating with the floor as your canvas. And I think there's a lot of these kind of style. I think they can be very effective. I love how the clothes are moving in this. Okay. And then this is one other suggestion from the same video maker. I really loved this suggestion. If you ever just need a tripod for your phone, I had not thought of this. It's very clever. You can just use a mug. And she says there's a sock in the bottom of the mug to keep it like really firmly in place. So this is also an option. Like if you want to shoot using your phone, you don't really need a tripod. You can set stuff up in a way that's just holding. Really, the important thing is that your camera is still. Okay, so you got your camera set up. You got to take a bunch of pictures. Now, this is technically the hard part. It doesn't have to be hard, though. I really encourage you to do it in a sort of expressionistic way, just sort of move stuff around, see what happens. The trickiest thing is to get other stuff to stay still while you take a picture, right? So you probably don't want to just hold stuff up because you want it to look like it's holding up on its own. So one trick is to do the shooting on the floor thing, right? So like once you take gravity out of the picture, things are a lot easier. Another sort of group of suggestions I have, one is just try to just not include things that are going to move. So in this example with my partner, we decided like right out the gate that his arms were just going to be down in the image. So obviously when we're taking it, he's putting his arms up and moving stuff around. But then at the time when I'm taking the shot, it's like, okay, they're just by his side. That's a much easier pose to hit than saying he's always going to put his hand like exactly in the same place in the frame every time. So a little bit of pre-planning, a little bit of thinking about like what each frame is going to look like is going to go a long way for you here in terms of how difficult this is. And then the stuff that you actually do want to move to keep up, this is a whole category of expertise called rigging. In animation, this is like 9/10 of animation is rigging. In this context, you can pin stuff together, you can tape stuff together, you can tie things with pieces of string, you can prop stuff up in various ways. You can prop stuff up just for one frame and then remove that prop later. Remember, you can do kind of whatever you want between the frames. A professional animator might Photoshop this out later or use like a green screen technique. Honestly, folks, I always tell myself I'm going to Photoshop it out later and then I just don't, and it doesn't matter. Nobody can see it. It's fine. So that's fine too. And then my other biggest tip here is just like try to use your props, use things that already can hold a pose themselves. So I know in this context, we're thinking about wearables, we're kind of thinking about fabric. Hard to tell a piece of fabric to stay in a really complicated pose, but it's easy to tell a piece of tinfoil to stay in a complicated pose. So if you pick a material that's already a little bit like willing to stay posed like that, there's a reason clay is very popular in stop motion. Claymation, clay can kind of do anything for a little bit. I mean, it might not stay up for like a year in that pose, but you need it to stay up for like 30 seconds while you take a picture. Okay. And then lastly, once you have a bunch of pictures, you got to stitch them together. I'm not going to talk too much about this right now, but the end of this deck has 4 different software options for that. If you have an Adobe license, Photoshop and Premiere are both very easy to use. There are several online pieces of software. I include a link. And if you're a hacker nerd like me, there's command line tools you can use as well. So that stuff, like I said, not going into detail, but it is part of the process. And it's part of the process that you will maybe need to figure out your favorite way to do it as well. Okay, are there questions about that? Was a whirlwind of ideas about animation and sort of, it was a little bit abstract. I do encourage you to go back to this slide where I'm like, okay, this is basically what I'm hoping y'all are doing today is making an animation with each other on Zoom, probably using your laptop camera like as the camera, maybe using your phone instead, possibly with a very simple backdrop like a blank wall or whatever, and not a whole lot of like character stuff going on, really just focusing on emotion. Is there a requirement for the content of the animation? Great question. We're going to talk about that next. I do want you to focus on what we've been talking about. So actuated wearables for an inclusive context. If there are no other questions, I would like to use that as a segue into the next bit of the workshop explanation. Okay, if there are questions, you can always come back, ask me, raise a hand, whatever. Okay. So the instructions for this workshop, I'm going to zip through these slides quickly, and then we'll go back up to the top and actually do them. But basically what we're going to do a brainstorming session where we're going to think about contexts and users and use cases for an actuated garment. Okay, also, sorry, I didn't say this. It's like obvious to me, but I didn't say this. I'm going to put you all in random breakout rooms of 3. So you're going to be in a team with 2 other people. For the rest of the lab. So you're going to brainstorm together, come up with a whole bunch of ideas along these lines. Then we're going to look at the spreadsheet together a little bit because I always think that's fun. Then back in your teams, you're going to choose one concept for the sort of overall, what could this garment even be? Then you're going to think about, okay, if we were making this garment, what would the motion be? So I don't want you guys in this video to really try to sell the context or the character or anything. This is not about like, oh, how do I make it look like this is a person in a library? Really, for the video part today, just the motion. But thinking of that context and user and stuff is going to get you to a place where you can think of interesting motions. So sort of high level concept, then specific motion. And then you guys are going to set up your camera and get your first frame. You're going to maybe decide which of you is actually going to be like the person in front of the camera and which folks are going to be more like directing and taking images. And at this point, there's a checkpoint. I'm going to need you guys to submit just that first frame, just to show me that you're set up, that you've got a camera, you've got an idea, and you're ready to go. And then the rest of class really is just playing with that. I want you to capture ultimately at least 25 frames. This sounds like a lot, but I swear to you, it's not, right? Like that little image, that video I showed you earlier, me and my partner, we took 10 frames in a minute and a half, right? Now, they're not interesting frames. You can do better than that, right? I'm trying to show you something that's sort of deliberately, I know you can do better than that. But actually capturing the frames can be fairly quick. So at least 25 is very much a lower bound. If you've got more time, keep going. You might be like, well, the motion I want to do is actually really short. That's fine. Shoot it again in ways that are like emotionally different, right? So it could still be accomplishing the same thing, but in a different way. Like maybe it's, you know, stealthier or more obnoxious about the way it does a thing. Again, the whole point of this is to kind of sketch what emotion even is, not just the easiest possible, most default motion that gets you from point A to point B, but maybe a motion with a little bit of character of its own. And so that's the high level. So again, in class, we're going to do some brainstorming and you're going to submit at least a first frame. And then before the next class, you're going to submit a full video as an upload to a Google form. So all three of these things are forms. Brainstorming is going to be on a form. First frame is also going to be on a form, and your homework is also on a form. So for the homework, I encourage you to submit the video you make with your team. You can submit it as a team, or for example, if you decide that the same motion could be used in a different context, you could submit, you know, your whole team could submit the same video, but like a different context explanation of where and when this might be useful. So those are both options. I'm saying that so that you don't feel like you really, really have to agree on a context as a team. You kind of only have to agree on a motion as a team. The contexts are to help you think about motions, and then to bring that back out, why is this even useful? Okay, that is the structure for today. We might already be a little behind schedule, which is a thing that happens. But are there questions about, actually, let's just say, are there questions about this first step? So to recap, we're gonna put you in random breakout rooms of 3, and you get 15 minutes, which sounds really short. Maybe it sounds long. I don't know. You're going to try to brainstorm as many interesting answers to sort of this, fill in this phrase as possible. And I want at least 10 from every room. You're like, oh, that's so many. No, it's not. You can do it. So it's for a person who's in a situation. We propose a garment that does a thing under a certain trigger. So Stephanie's example that she showed us on Tuesday for an AAC user who's communicating with someone who doesn't know them very well, it's a chair-mounted sidekick that does a little wait a moment gesture to the other person while the user is typing. So that's the sort of way of filling in this template for Stephanie's project. I thought of this one last night. It's okay, the context, it's the person is a stressed out student. They're studying, it's late at night, they're hyperfixating, so they're forgetting to drink water. So we propose a water carrying backpack that comes down and tells them, hey, drink some water every half hour. And you can imagine lots of ways that could happen on a motion level, but that's the sort of user, what's going wrong? What's the context? What is my thing going to do about it under sort of what specific circumstance? So the trigger is important here too. In the first example, the trigger is the user's typing. That's how I know what to do. In the second example, the trigger is it's just going to do it every half hour. It's a time-based trigger. Okay,